This is a review of the lesson on relative clause, which I already sent to you in the form of a handout. Uh, in Latin, as in English, the relative clause can be described as, first, it is a subordinate clause, meaning to say it cannot stand on its own. It has to depend on a main clause or independent clause. Secondly, as a type of subordinate clause, it is called as adjectival clause. Why? Because the entire clause functions like an adjective. Third, a relative clause is introduced by a relative pronoun, which has an antecedent in the main clause. So we will go back to these concepts as we go on. In Latin, the relative clause is qui, que, quod. Ang declension kayan, complete declension, masculine, feminine, neuter, singular, and plural, yaon yan sa indong mga grammar books. So it is your responsibility to know where to find it so that you know how to use it. So I do not ask you to memorize quick quod. Although if you memorize it, it's much better. Pero I do not require you. What I require you is you get familiar with it and you know the place in your grammar books where you will find the complete declension, or what we call paradigm, of the relative pronoun qui, que, quod. So, before we proceed to our review of the relative clause, let us have some excursus. Go back to what you have learned in your English grammar class and maybe in your earlier studies of Latin. So in English, as in Latin, a clause is defined as a group of words with a subject and a predicate. So, in English grammar, we identify two groups of words. One is clause, the other is a phrase. Ang pagkakaiba kan duwa, iyon na ang clause iguaning subject and predicate. So, a phrase is just a group of words. No subject, no predicate. So, yeah. Now, there are two kinds of clause. Main clause and subordinate clause. Ano ang pagkakaiba kan duwa? Na-mention ko na kasubago. Ang main clause is a complete sentence. Why? Because it expresses a complete thought and it can stand by itself. Kompleto na yan. May na yan. Sentence na yan. Napod yan. A main clause is actually a sentence. And that is why it can stand alone. It is also called as independent clause. Other English grammar books would call it also as primary clause. So, but for our purpose, we will use the term main clause. The second kind of clause is subordinate clause, which is different from a main clause. Why? Because a subordinate clause is not a complete sentence. Dawa pa yan iguaning subject and predicate, it is not a complete sentence. It does not express a complete thought. And it cannot stand by itself. Kung sa paghuna mo complete sentence yan, complete thought, ang English mo kaya garong Baroque English. So, remember that a subordinate clause is not a complete sentence. Therefore, it needs the main clause. That is why it is called dependent. Minadepende siya sa main clause or sa independent clause. And that's why it's called dependent. And in Some grammar books, it is also called as secondary. So kung may primary, may secondary. May independent, may dependent. May main, may subordinate. So, as I've said, for our classes, we will use the terms main clause and subordinate clause. Now, in Latin, we identify three main clauses. You have noun clause, adjectival clause, and adverbial clause. As we go along with our lessons, we will meet these kinds of clauses in future lessons. But as for today, we are focused on number 2, adjectival clause. An example of this in Latin is the relative clause. At the beginning of this lecture, we already mentioned that a relative clause is introduced by a relative pronoun. There can be no relative clause kung mayo ning relative pronoun. And this pronoun, ining relative pronoun, it takes the place of the antecedent. Ang antecedent, makukuha iyan sa main clause, which is either a noun or a pronoun. So the relative clause, therefore, or the relative pronoun, I mean, is the pronoun that takes the place of the antecedent in the main clause. So, iko dyaning noun or pronoun sa main clause, yan ang pinag-take place kang relative pronoun. Example given there, Jesus called Peter, who was a fisherman in Galilee. Yan underlined words dyan. Ini naka-underline, who was a fisherman in Galilee. Iyan ang relative clause. Introduced by a relative pronoun, who. And ining relative pronoun, who ini, ang antecedent kayan, iyo ang Peter. Peter is the antecedent of who. Yaon sa si Peter, yaon siya digdi sa main clause. Jesus called Peter. O, ilingan nindo. Jesus called Peter, it can stand alone. Complete thought na yan. Who was a fisherman in Galilee? Bako yan, complete thought. Kaya kay puhan magtakod siya sa main clause. So, by the way, nalingawan kong i-mention, pag igawang main clause sa subordinate clause, ang apod kang sentence na yan, structurally speaking, ang apod na kayan is complex sentence. Complex sentence. Okay. So, this example na ini, who is the relative pronoun, introducing the entire relative clause, and Peter is the antecedent, which is in the main clause. Kung analyze yung taning main clause, you have Jesus, subject, called, verb, Peter, direct object. Kung analyze yung taman ining relative clause, who is the subject, was, linking verb, fisherman, complement noun, in Galilee, adverbial na yan, prepositional phrase. Okay. Now, in Latin, there is a rule of agreement. Kung natatandaan nindo, luman sa lesson number 1, may lista kita dumaning mga rules of agreement. Ining rule of agreement between the relative pronoun and its antecedent. Ano ang sabi kang rule? The relative pronoun agrees with its antecedent in gender and number, but not in case. But not in case. So, kung i-translate sa Latin, example ta dyan, yung Jesus called Peter, who was a fisherman in Galilee. In Latin, it will be, Jesus vocavit Petrum, qui erat piscator in Galilea. So, Petrum is the antecedent. And we have said kasubago na direct object ini. Kaya ini accusative case. And it is masculine singular. Ngunyan, we must agree with Peter in gender and number. Kaya ang we is masculine and singular. So, yun yan ang correct form, kan relative pronoun dyan. We, no other form ang pwedeng ilaag dyan. But, as we will see, we does not agree with Petrum in case. Ang Petrum, as direct object, is accusative case. And we, as the subject of the relative clause, is nominative case. So, mahihiling taligdi na ining we, nominative, Petrum, accusative, mamanyan sa rule of agreement. And what determines the case of the relative pronoun? So, yan ang question na sunod niya itong sisimbagon. Okay. What determines the case of the relative pronoun in the relative clause? Ang simbag kayan, its grammatical function. Kung subject siya sa relative clause, nominative case yan. Kung genitive case yan sa relative clause, possessor yan. Kung indirect object yan sa relative clause, naturalmente, dative case yan. Kung direct object yan sa relative clause, accusative case. And then, ablative yan, kung object of ablatives, kung ablative of agent, ablative of means, and so on and so forth. Object of prepositions that govern ablative case. So, illustrate ko dyan ining 4 examples. Duman sa previous example, pinahiling na duman na ang relative pronoun is nominative because it is the subject of the relative clause. In this additional 4 sentences, you will notice na ginamit ang gabos ng mga cases. Sentence number 1, relative clause is Quius mother vivit in Galilea, whose mother lived in Galilee. Quius is genitive case because it is the possessor. Ang antecedent niya is Petrum. Again, masculine singular, agreeing with Petrum. Sa ikadawang sentence, Qui Dominus claves regni dedit, to whom the Lord gave the keys of the kingdom. To whom, qui is indirect object, kaya dative case. So, ang grammatical function kan qui in the relative clause is indirect object. Example number 3, quem apostoli honoraverunt. In English, whom the apostles honor. So, quem is masculine singular, agreeing with Peter, but it is accusative case because it is the direct object of the relative clause. Number 4, a quo ecclesia gesta est, by whom the church is managed or governed. Quo, object of a. Pero, ano ang grammatical function kang quo dyan? It is just simply an object of a, but it is an ablative of agent. So, mahihiling na ninyo yan, quius, possessor, qui, indirect object, quem, direct object, quo, ablative of agent. So, yan ang mga grammatical functions kaining mga relative pronouns sa saindang relative clauses. Kaya mahihiling ta, the answer to the question is the relative pronoun, the case of the relative pronoun will depend upon its grammatical function within the relative case.